The satellite feed cut out at 3:47 hours, and when it flickered back online 16 seconds later, the entire valley had changed. Where there had been three forward operating bases arranged in a defensive triangle across the Afghan highlands, there was now only fire. Thermal signatures bloomed white-hot across the monitors at Bagram, each pixel representing something that had been alive moments before. The duty officer's hand trembled as he reached for the radio, his voice cracking through frequencies that suddenly seemed too quiet, too empty. He called for air support. He called for QRF. He called for anyone. The static that answered back felt like the end of something. In the mountains, 200 kilometers from the nearest airfield, 400 Marines were about to die, and nobody was close enough to hear them scream. The attack had been surgical, coordinated with a precision that spoke of months of planning. Enemy forces had moved through gaps in satellite coverage like ghosts, materializing from the canyon systems in numbers that made the intelligence estimates look like children's drawings. The firebase commanders were screaming into radios, their voices layered with overlapping distress calls that painted a picture of absolute chaos. Mortar fire walked across defensive positions with mathematical precision. The enemy knew exactly where every bunker stood, every ammunition cache, every weakness in the wire. Someone had been watching for a long time. At Kandahar Airfield, 600 kilometers south, the alert klaxon wailed into the pre-dawn darkness. Pilots stumbled from their racks, pulling on flight suits and grabbing helmets in the practiced chaos of scramble procedure. The brief was delivered in gasps between sprints to the flight line, multiple bases under coordinated assault, casualty estimates climbing by the minute. Every available aircraft was already airborne or down for maintenance. The tankers were committed. The Apache were Winchester, their ammunition expended in earlier operations. The F-16s had the speed but not the loiter time, not the payload, not the low-altitude capability needed to work danger close in mountain terrain where the peaks reached higher than most bombing runs. The officer delivering the brief looked at the assembled pilots with something like grief in his eyes, because they all understood what he wasn't saying. There wasn't enough. There would never be enough. Not in time. That's when someone remembered the warthog sitting on the far end of the ramp, the one that had been written off the flight schedule for the past week with hydraulic issues. And they remembered who had refused to leave its side, who had been sleeping in the maintenance hangar, who had been elbow-deep in systems that the crew chiefs had already declared unflyable. They remembered her call sign, the one spoken with smirks and rolled eyes. Prophet. Not because anyone believed she could see the future, but because she kept insisting she could feel when her aircraft was trying to tell her something. And everyone knew that was just crazy talk from a pilot who should have washed out years ago. The maintenance chief found her under the A-10's belly, her flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid and grease, her hand still wrapped around a torque wrench. She'd been working for 38 hours straight, pausing only for water and the kind of brief, standing sleep that comes from pure exhaustion. Her eyes were bloodshot, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but when he told her what was happening in the mountains, something shifted behind her expression. She didn't ask if the aircraft was flight-ready. She didn't ask for permission. She asked only one question, her voice rough from disuse and dust. How many? When he told her 400, she was already moving, climbing into the cockpit with movements that looked like muscle memory overriding conscious thought. The crew chief opened his mouth to protest, to explain that the hydraulics were marginal, that she'd been awake too long, that the pre-flight checklist alone would take 20 minutes they didn't have. She was already running startup procedures, her hands dancing across switches and buttons with the kind of certainty that comes from thousands of hours in the seat. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine growl, and the A-10 seemed to shudder like a waking predator. The tower controller's voice came through her helmet speakers with confusion and concern. She wasn't on the flight schedule. She wasn't cleared for takeoff. The aircraft wasn't certified airworthy. She keyed her mic once, twice, her response stripped down to the essential truth that would define everything that followed. Prophet is airborne. 400 souls need me more than paperwork does. Then she released the brakes and the Warthog rolled forward, gathering speed across tarmac that suddenly seemed too short, the loaded weapons pylons making the aircraft heavy and angry and perfect. She rotated at the last possible moment, the landing gear kissing the concrete one final time before she clawed for altitude, her heading already locked toward mountains that were 600 kilometers of impossible distance away. In the tower, the controller stared at his radar screen as her transponder code moved north, tracking toward a situation that every tactical analysis said was already lost. He made no move to call her back. Some decisions lived beyond the reach of regulations. Some pilots flew beyond the limits of what anyone thought possible. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, and Prophet was already racing against time itself, her aircraft loaded with 30mm ammunition and Maverick missiles, and the kind of desperate hope that sometimes changed the course of battles. The mountains rose before her like cathedral walls, their peaks catching the first light of dawn, while the valleys below remained drowned in shadow. She pushed the A-10 lower, skimming through canyons that hadn't seen American aircraft in months, following terrain that made her navigation system scream warnings about minimum altitude. The Warthog was built for this, designed to fly low and slow and ugly through the worst that Earth and enemy could throw at it. But the canyons were narrow, the walls pressing in from both sides, and at 300 knots the margin between perfect control and catastrophic failure measured in heartbeats. She flew with her hands gentle on the stick, reading the air through the aircraft's responses, feeling the thermals rising from the warming valley floors and the downdrafts spilling over ridgelines. The radio chatter from the besieged bases grew louder as she closed the distance, the voices taking on the particular quality of men who had moved beyond fear into the crystalline clarity that came just before the end. They were calling grid coordinates for final protective fires, requesting that artillery drop shells on their own positions because the enemy was inside the wire. They were saying goodbye to wives and children whose voices they would never hear again. One voice, younger than the others, kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "Don't let them take us alive." Prophet listened to it all, her jaw set, her eyes tracking the horizon where smoke pillars marked the locations of the dying bases. She ran calculations in her head, factoring fuel consumption against weapons load against transit time. The mathematics were brutal. Even if she flew the perfect profile, even if every system held together, even if she hit every target on the first pass, she would arrive with maybe 15 minutes of combat time before she had to brake for the tanker. 15 minutes to change the outcome of a battle that had already been raging for over an hour. 15 minutes to do what an entire air wing with unlimited resources might not accomplish. The numbers didn't work. They had never worked. But she had stopped believing in numbers the day she learned that aircraft could speak if you listened carefully enough. And right now her A-10 was telling her it had one more impossible mission left in its scarred and riveted bones. She believed the aircraft more than she believed the math. The first base came into view as she crested a ridgeline, and what she saw made her breath catch despite years of training and combat experience. The defensive perimeter had collapsed on the northern side, and enemy forces were pouring through the gap like water through a broken dam. She could see muzzle flashes, could see the tracers forming geometric patterns in the morning light, could see the Marines falling back toward a final defensive line that wouldn't hold for more than minutes. She didn't announce her presence. She simply rolled, inverted, and pulled, diving toward the combat at an angle that put the sun directly behind her, coming out of the light like an ancient god of war. Her finger found the trigger for the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the 7-barrel rotary gun that was less a weapon and more the defining feature of an aircraft built around it. The sound that followed was not gunfire but something deeper, a mechanical roar that seemed to tear the fabric of reality itself. 70 rounds per second, each projectile the size of a milk bottle, depleted uranium penetrators designed to punch through Soviet tank armor. She walked the fire across the enemy position with surgical precision, the cannon's distinctive BRRRRT sound rolling across the valley like thunder. Below, enemy fighters simply ceased to exist, their bodies and weapons and courage erased by a stream of metal moving at speeds that defied comprehension. The Marines who had been seconds from being overrun suddenly found themselves staring at a line of destruction that looked like the hand of God had reached down and drawn a finger across the earth. Someone on the radio was screaming her call sign, their voice breaking with something between terror and joy. "Prophet! Prophet is in the fight!" She didn't respond. She was already arcing up and around, bleeding off speed, configuring for another pass while her eyes tracked the next concentration of enemy forces. The second pass was rockets, the Hydra 70s rippling from their pods in a sequence that turned the enemy's fallback position into a zone of fragmentation and fire. She flew through her own debris field, felt the aircraft shudder as spent rocket motors tumbled past her canopy, pulled hard to avoid the ridgeline that was rising to meet her faster than seemed possible. The hydraulic system that she'd been nursing for the past week groaned in protest, the gauges flickering as pressure fluctuated beyond normal parameters. She coaxed the stick with the gentleness of a lover, feeling the aircraft respond, feeling it hold together through sheer determination. 3 more enemy positions died under her guns in the next 4 minutes, each pass a calculated risk that brought her lower, slower, more vulnerable to the ground fire that was starting to find her altitude. She could hear the rounds hitting the armored bathtub that surrounded her cockpit, could hear the pinging of small arms fire against titanium plating that had been designed for exactly this kind of punishment. The A-10 was built to take damage and keep flying, built to absorb punishment that would down any other aircraft, and right now it was living up to every promise its designers had ever made. But even the Warthog had limits. The surface-to-air missile launched from a concealed position in the eastern canyon, its smoke trail rising like a question mark against the morning sky. Prophet saw it at the same moment her warning system screamed, saw it and knew immediately that she had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. She could brake hard, could dump flares and chaff and use the terrain to break the missile's lock. She could save herself. But braking would take her out of position, would give the enemy forces time to regroup, would mean the Marines at the southern base, the ones she hadn't reached yet, would die. 3 seconds to choose between self-preservation and mission completion. 3 seconds to decide what kind of pilot she was going to be. She held her course, continued her run, triggered the Mavericks while the missile closed the distance at speeds that made thought impossible. The air-to-ground missiles streaked away toward their targets, fire-and-forget weapons that would complete their mission even if she didn't. Then she waited, counting heartbeats, her hands steady on the controls, her voice calm as she keyed the radio one last time. Prophet continuing the attack. The SAM detonated 20 meters behind her tail, close enough that the overpressure wave felt like being hit by a giant's fist. The A-10 pitched forward violently, systems failing in cascading sequence, the right engine spooling down with a sound like tearing metal. Shrapnel had punched through the tail section, severing hydraulic lines and electrical bundles and control surfaces that suddenly felt dead under her hands. She fought the aircraft as it tried to swap ends, fought the inevitable physics of an airplane that wanted to stop flying and start falling. The rudder was gone. The right aileron was jammed. The backup hydraulic system was showing 0 pressure. She was flying a machine that no longer wanted to be flown, maintaining control through pure force of will and manipulation of engine thrust. The working engine was screaming at military power, trying to compensate for the asymmetric thrust of its dead companion. Black smoke poured from the damaged engine nacelle, trailing behind her like a banner, marking her position for every enemy fighter on the ground. She should have ejected. Every procedure, every training scenario, every logical analysis of her situation screamed that she should pull the handles and let the rocket motor carry her to relative safety. But the southern base was right there, 3 kilometers ahead, and she could see them on her remaining display, could see the enemy forces massing for a final assault. If she ejected now, those Marines would die. She had maybe 90 seconds of controlled flight remaining before the laws of physics caught up with her. 90 seconds to finish what she'd started. She dove toward the target area with her dying aircraft, no longer flying so much as channeling what remained of the Warthog's momentum toward one final act of defiance. The cannon still worked. The ammunition counter showed 240 rounds remaining. It would be enough. It had to be enough. She lined up on the enemy concentration with no regard for her escape route, because there was no escape route. There was only this moment and this target and the trigger under her finger. The GAU-8 spoke one last time, its roar mixing with the shriek of failing systems and warning klaxons and her own breathing inside the helmet. The enemy position evaporated under the stream of depleted uranium, vehicles exploding, fighters scattering, the attack that would have killed everyone at the southern base dying before it could be born. Then she was past the target, past the base, past the point where controlled flight was possible. The A-10 was falling now, the nose dropping despite her pulling back on the stick with both hands, the working engine no longer producing enough thrust to overcome gravity and damage. The canyon walls rose on either side, narrowing to a slot that was barely wider than her wingspan. She rode the aircraft down like a jockey on a dying horse, coaxing and pleading and demanding just a few more seconds. The wheels touched earth in what could only generously be called a landing, the landing gear collapsing immediately, the aircraft skidding forward on its belly in a shower of sparks and torn metal. She was still moving at 80 knots when she hit the boulder field, the impacts throwing her against her harness hard enough to crack ribs, the world outside the canopy becoming a blur of rock and fire and disintegrating aircraft parts. The A-10 finally stopped moving in a cloud of dust and smoke, its spine broken, its systems dead, its mission complete. Prophet sat in the cockpit for a moment, breathing hard, checking herself for injuries and finding only pain and exhaustion and the strange lightness that came from being alive when you had every reason to be dead. Her hands shook as she released the harness straps. She had to climb out manually, the canopy jettison system no longer responding to inputs. She stood on the wing root, swaying slightly, looking back at the aircraft that had carried her through impossible odds. That looked like it had been through a war because it had. Smoke rose from a dozen wounds. Hydraulic fluid pooled on the ground beneath it. The tail section was simply gone, sheared away by the missile hit. But the nose art was still visible beneath the scoring and damage, still legible. They had painted it there as a joke 3 years ago, a jab at her unusual call sign and her insistence that she could feel what her aircraft needed. She had never asked them to remove it. Now she stood staring at those letters while her aircraft burned behind her, while the radio crackled with voices calling her name, while the Marines she had saved were organizing rescue parties to reach her position. The nose art read simply, "Prophet," she knew. They had meant it as mockery. She had worn it as identity. And now, in the morning light of the Afghan highlands, with 400 lives saved and one aircraft destroyed and her own body broken but breathing, the words felt less like a joke and more like the truth that had been waiting all along. She had known. The aircraft had told her it had one more fight left. She had believed. And together they had written an ending that no tactical analysis would have predicted, no computer model would have calculated, no reasonable person would have thought possible. The sound of rotors reached her ears, the rescue Black Hawk making its approach, and Prophet allowed herself to sit down heavily on what remained of her wing, allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. The sky above was brilliant blue, unmarked by smoke or flame. The silence, after so much noise, felt like grace. She had flown through fire and come out the other side. 400 Marines would go home to their families because she had refused to accept the math. The rescue came quickly, the Black Hawk settling into the canyon with the kind of precision flying that spoke of pilots who understood what it meant to pull someone out of bad situations. The crew chief reached her first, his eyes widening as he took in the condition of the crashed A-10, the impossible distance she had flown it while it was actively dying. He opened his mouth to ask if she was injured, but the words died unspoken when he saw her face, saw the exhaustion and the pain and the absolute certainty of someone who had looked death in the eye and decided it could wait. She let them help her into the helicopter, let them strap her onto the stretcher even though she insisted she could walk, let the medic start an IV line and check her vitals and mutter about shock and dehydration and probable internal injuries. Through the open door of the Blackhawk, she watched her A-10 growing smaller as they gained altitude, watched the smoke from its burning engine rising like a signal fire in the ancient hills. She thought about the crew chief at Kandahar who had tried to ground that aircraft, about the maintenance logs that said it shouldn't fly, about the regulations she had broken and the procedures she had ignored. She thought about the 400 voices on the radio, the ones that had been saying goodbye to their families, the ones that were now calling her name with reverence and disbelief. The flight to Bagram took 40 minutes, and she spent most of it drifting in and out of consciousness, her mind replaying the mission in fragments of memory and sensation. The feeling of the stick in her hand as the aircraft died around her. The sound of the GAU-8 tearing through enemy positions. The moment she chose the mission over her own survival, the moment everything became simple and clear. When they loaded her into the ambulance at Bagram, there were people lining the flight line, and she realized through her pain-fogged awareness that they were standing at attention, saluting as she passed. Pilots and crew chiefs and ground personnel, all of them watching her go by with expressions she couldn't quite read. Later, in the hospital bed with her ribs taped and pain medication dulling the edges of everything, she would learn that she had become famous in the 6 hours since she'd launched from Kandahar. Someone had leaked the cockpit audio, the recording of her final transmissions as she flew her dying aircraft toward the last target. The phrase "Prophet continuing the attack" had already spread through every military social media channel, had been picked up by news organizations, had become the kind of viral content that defined eras. She didn't care about any of that. She cared about the message that came through official channels 3 days later, the one that listed casualty figures from the battle. 400 Marines had been at those 3 bases when the attack began. 397 had survived. The 3 who died had been gone before she arrived, killed in the opening salvos before anyone had known they needed saving. 397 out of 400, odds that looked like miracles when you wrote them down, odds that would never have existed if she hadn't spent 38 hours refusing to give up on an aircraft that everyone else had written off. She kept the message, even though protocol said she should delete it, even though it was just numbers on a screen. Those numbers represented names, families, futures that would unfold because she had believed in something beyond logic. The investigation came later, inevitable as weather. A review board convened to examine her decision to launch in an aircraft that wasn't certified airworthy, to fly a mission while exhausted, to violate procedures and regulations and common sense. She sat before the panel of senior officers in her dress uniform, her ribbons and medals bright against the dark fabric, and answered their questions with the simple truth. Yes, she had known the aircraft was marginal. Yes, she had been awake for 38 hours. Yes, she had understood the risks. And yes, she would do it again because some calculations involved variables that didn't appear in flight manuals. The panel deliberated for 6 hours, and when they returned, the ranking general looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He spoke about regulations and safety, and the importance of following established procedures. He spoke about the duty to preserve military resources and the need to maintain good order and discipline. He spoke for 20 minutes about all the ways she had failed to meet the standards expected of an Air Force officer. Then he paused, and something shifted in his voice, became less formal and more human. He spoke about the 397 lives saved, about the families who would welcome their loved ones home, about the children who would grow up knowing their fathers because a pilot had refused to accept the impossible. He spoke about the tradition of military aviation, the legacy of pilots who pushed beyond limits because the mission demanded it and their conscience required it. When he finished, the verdict was not what anyone expected. Not a court-martial, not a medal, something more nuanced, more honest. A letter of reprimand for her personnel file, acknowledging the procedures broken and the risks taken. and a personal commendation from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, acknowledging that some acts of valor existed in the spaces between regulations, that sometimes the right thing to do was also the unauthorized thing to do. She left the hearing with both documents in hand, official recognition that she was simultaneously a pilot who had violated protocol and a hero who had saved 400 lives, both truths existing side by side because reality was complex and messy and didn't fit neatly into procedural boxes. The media coverage intensified after the hearing, journalists wanting to interview her, to ask how it felt to be famous, to be called a hero. She declined every request. What she had done wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the bond between pilot and aircraft, the responsibility to protect those who depended on you, the understanding that some truths couldn't be found in technical manuals or tactical doctrines. The real story wasn't about her. It was about the A-10 that had kept flying long after it should have fallen from the sky, about the Marines who had held their positions against impossible odds, about the crew chief who had tried to ground her aircraft, but ultimately let her go because he understood that sometimes rules existed to be broken. 3 months after the mission, she returned to flight status, assigned to a different squadron with a different aircraft. The new A-10 was pristine, fresh from depot maintenance, all its systems functioning perfectly. It flew like a dream, responsive and powerful and completely reliable. She hated it. Not because it wasn't a good aircraft, but because it didn't speak to her the way the other one had, didn't have the quirks and personalities that came from thousands of hours in combat. It was too perfect, too new, too ready to do exactly what she asked without argument or attitude. She flew her missions professionally, executed her training flights with precision, and tried not to think about the wreckage still sitting in that Afghan canyon, the pieces of the aircraft that had saved 400 lives slowly being reclaimed by the desert. They had offered to give her the nose art panel, the section with profit, she knew still visible beneath the scoring and damage. She had declined. Some things belonged where they fell, monuments to moments that defined more than they described. But the call sign stuck, evolved from mockery into something else, something that younger pilots spoke with respect when they passed her in the halls or saw her name on the flight schedule. They wanted to know how she had known the aircraft would hold together, how she had known to spend those 38 hours in the hangar, how she had known that one more mission was possible. She never had a good answer. You felt it or you didn't. You listened or you didn't. You believed in the partnership between pilot and machine, or you treated aircraft as tools to be used and discarded. The documentary came a year later, someone at the Air Force Public Affairs Office deciding that her story was the kind of thing that would help with recruiting, that would show the public what modern military aviation looked like. They interviewed the Marines she had saved, men who spoke with tears in their eyes about the sound of her cannon, about the moment they realized they weren't going to die. They interviewed the crew chief who had found her under the aircraft that night, who still insisted she should never have launched, who also said he'd never seen anyone fly the way she flew. They interviewed the general who had led her hearing, who admitted that the decision about how to handle her case had kept him awake for nights, wrestling with the tension between duty to regulations and duty to truth. They interviewed her last, in a hangar with another sitting behind her, and asked her what she wanted people to understand about that mission. She thought for a long time before answering, trying to find words for things that lived beyond language. Finally, she spoke about trust, about the relationship between pilot and aircraft that went deeper than mechanical knowledge, about listening to what your airplane was trying to tell you even when it seemed crazy. She spoke about the moment in the air when she chose to continue the attack instead of braking for the missile, about how that choice felt less like courage and more like inevitability, the only possible response to the situation in front of her. She spoke about the Marines on the ground, about how every decision she made was filtered through the reality of their lives hanging in the balance. And she spoke about the call sign that had started as mockery and become identity, about how sometimes the things people said about you in jest became the things you grew into, became true through the living of them. The documentary aired on military networks and streaming services, accumulating millions of views in its first week, becoming one of those viral sensations that captured public imagination. People who knew nothing about military aviation watched it and felt something, recognized something human in the story of a pilot and her aircraft, and 400 lives hanging in the balance. The comments sections filled with arguments about regulations versus results, about whether she should have been punished or promoted, about what military discipline meant in the age of social media. She didn't read the comments. She was too busy flying missions, training new pilots, doing the daily work of military aviation that continued regardless of documentary fame. But the documentary changed something in the wider culture of the Air Force, started conversations about when to follow procedures and when to trust the judgment of experienced pilots, about whether modern aviation had become too dependent on technology and too dismissive of intuition. Flight schools began teaching her mission as a case study, not because everything she did was right, but because it illustrated the complex decision-making required in combat aviation, the way that rules and reality sometimes diverged, and pilots had to navigate the space between. Young pilots coming through training spoke her call sign with reverence, wanted to know if the stories were true, if she had really felt the aircraft telling her it could fly one more mission. She told them the truth as she understood it, that aircraft were partners, not tools, and partnerships required listening as much as commanding. Some of them understood immediately, their eyes lighting up with recognition. Others looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language, locked into a worldview where machines were machines and flying was just a technical skill to master. She couldn't teach the ones who didn't understand. They would either learn through experience or they wouldn't, would either develop the sensitivity required to hear what their aircraft said, or they would remain competent but uninspired pilots. Both were valuable. Both had their place, but only one would ever earn a call sign like Prophet. 2 years after the mission, she was promoted to major and given command of a training squadron, responsible for preparing new A-10 pilots for combat deployment. It was considered a significant honor, a sign that the Air Force valued her experience and wanted her to pass on what she knew. She accepted the position because refusing would have been political suicide, but privately she mourned the loss of regular flight time, the reduction in hours she would spend in the cockpit in favor of hours spent in meetings and administrative tasks. Command was important, leadership mattered, but nothing quite compared to the feeling of pushing an A-10 into a dive with full weapons load, knowing that you were flying the most dangerous close air support aircraft ever built. She tried to bring that passion to her teaching, tried to show her students that flying was more than procedures and checklists, that it was an art form disguised as technical skill. Some got it. Most didn't, at least not at first. They would learn or they wouldn't. The ones who eventually understood would be the ones who survived impossible situations, who found ways through scenarios that looked unwinnable. The ones who never understood would still be fine pilots, still serve with honor, still accomplish their missions. But they would never be legends. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning, buried in her email between flight schedule updates and administrative reminders. The squadron of Marines she had saved, the ones from the southern base who had been seconds from being overrun, were having a reunion. They wanted her to attend as guest of honor, wanted to thank her personally, wanted her to meet the children who existed because their fathers had come home. She stared at the invitation for a long time, her finger hovering over the delete button. She didn't do well with gratitude, with people treating her like some kind of savior. She had just been doing her job, doing what any pilot would have done in her position. The fact that she had succeeded where others might have failed didn't make her special. It made her lucky. But something about the invitation pulled at her, the mention of the children who existed because of split-second decisions made in a canyon 6,000 miles away. She had never thought about the downstream effects, the futures that branched from that morning, the lives that would unfold across decades, because she had refused to accept the mathematics of failure. She accepted the invitation. The reunion was held at Camp Pendleton, in a conference hall that had been decorated with photographs from the deployment, images of young Marines in combat gear standing in front of mountains that looked beautiful and deadly. She arrived early, wearing her dress uniform because she wasn't sure what else to wear, and found herself immediately surrounded by men who looked at her with expressions she still couldn't quite read. They shook her hand, these Marines who had been on the ground that morning, and she saw in their eyes the memory of how close they had come to dying, how the sound of her cannon had been the sweetest thing they'd ever heard. One of them, a gunnery sergeant with silver in his hair and scars on his hands, gripped her shoulder and couldn't speak, just stood there with tears running down his face. She held his gaze and nodded, because some things didn't require words, some moments of connection lived beyond language. They wanted her to speak, to address the assembled group, to say something meaningful about that day and what it had meant. She stood at the podium and looked out at 397 faces, many of them holding children who hadn't existed when their fathers went to Afghanistan, many of them accompanied by wives and parents and loved ones who had almost lost them. She had prepared remarks, had written something about duty and honor and the privilege of serving. She threw them away and spoke from her heart instead, spoke about being terrified that morning, about not knowing if she would reach them in time, about the partnership with her aircraft that had made the impossible possible. She spoke about the 3 who had died before she arrived, the ones she couldn't save, whose names she had memorized and whose faces she saw sometimes in her dreams. She spoke about how survival was often luck as much as skill, about how she had made decisions that could easily have ended differently, about how heroism and stupidity sometimes looked identical until you knew the outcome. And she spoke about what they had taught her, these Marines she had never met but had been willing to die for, about how seeing their courage under fire had changed her understanding of what duty meant, what service required, what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. When she finished, the silence lasted for several heartbeats before the applause began, and then they were standing, all of them, the Marines and their families, standing and applauding and some of them crying, and she realized that she was crying too, that the armor she kept wrapped around her emotions had finally cracked. The rest of the reunion passed in a blur of conversations and introductions, Marines bringing their children to meet her, to show her the futures that existed because she had flown through fire. A 5-year-old girl with her father's eyes, a newborn son who would never know how close he came to not existing. Teenagers who shook her hand with adolescent awkwardness, not quite understanding why this Air Force major was important to their family's story. She held each child's hand, looked into each set of eyes, and saw the weight of that morning crystallized into flesh and blood and infinite possibility. These were the stakes that tactical briefings never captured, the human consequences that lived beyond casualty statistics. Every decision she had made in that cockpit, every risk she had accepted, every regulation she had violated, all of it was justified by this room full of people who were alive to complain and celebrate and exist. The gunnery sergeant who had gripped her shoulder earlier found her again as the reunion was winding down, found her standing alone by the photograph wall, staring at images of younger men in a harder place. He stood beside her in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking, his voice rough with emotion and honesty. He told her that he had been the one on the radio that morning, the young voice repeating, "Don't let them take us alive," the one who had given up hope and was just trying to choose how to die. He told her that when he heard her cannon, when he realized someone had actually come, he had fallen to his knees and wept like a child. He told her that he thought about her every single day, that his wife knew Prophet's name better than she knew most of his unit buddies, that his children had been raised on the story of the pilot who came through fire to save their daddy. He told her that he had left the Marines after that deployment, that he couldn't go back to war after coming so close to death, that he sometimes felt guilty about that choice. She listened to all of it, heard the complexity of survival guilt and gratitude, and the struggle to reconcile who you were with what you'd experienced. When he finished, she told him something she had never said to anyone, something she had barely admitted to herself. She told him that she thought about that morning every day too, that she still had nightmares about arriving 30 seconds later, about the cannon jamming, about the aircraft failing before she could complete the mission. She told him that survival changed everyone who experienced it, that there was no right way to process the gift of continued existence, that guilt was just love with nowhere to go. They stood together in that space of shared understanding, the pilot and the Marine, connected by a morning 6 years past that had defined both their futures. The sun was setting as she drove away from Camp Pendleton, painting the California sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of fire and smoke, and the dawn light over Afghan mountains. She thought about the children she had met, about the future spreading out like ripples from a single stone dropped in still water, about how one person's choices could cascade through time in ways impossible to predict or measure. She thought about the A-10 slowly rusting in that distant canyon, about whether anyone had recovered the nose art panel, about whether future archaeologists would find it, and wonder about the pilot called Prophet who had known something the world thought impossible. She thought about call signs and identity, about how the names we are given sometimes become the truths we grow into, about how mockery can transform into prophecy through the living of it. She thought about the crew chief at Kandahar who had tried to ground her aircraft, who had been absolutely right according to every regulation and completely wrong according to the outcome. She thought about the young pilots in her squadron, the ones learning to fly the Warthog, the ones who would someday face their own impossible choices in their own distant canyons. What would she tell them? What wisdom could she pass on that wasn't just survivorship bias and lucky coincidence? The only truth she knew with certainty was that aircraft spoke if you listened, that partnerships required trust, that some things couldn't be taught but only experienced, felt, understood through the accumulation of hours in the seat and situations that tested your limits. She could show them the technical skills, the tactical procedures, the regulations they needed to follow. But the thing that had made the difference that morning, the ability to feel what her aircraft needed, to trust that feeling over logic and data, that was something each pilot had to discover alone. She pulled into her driveway as full darkness fell, sat in her car for a moment looking at the house she barely lived in, the home that felt more like a place she stored her belongings between deployments and training rotations. Command meant more time on the ground, more time in offices and meeting rooms, less time in the sky where she felt most herself. She wondered if this was what success looked like in military aviation, if rising through the ranks meant gradually being pulled away from the thing you loved most. She wondered if she should have stayed a captain forever, just kept flying missions, just kept being the person in the cockpit instead of the person making schedules and reviewing paperwork. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true, knew that her role now was to pass on what she had learned, to shape the next generation of pilots who would face their own versions of that Afghan morning. Legacy wasn't just about your own accomplishments. It was about the skills and wisdom and perspective you gave to those who came after, the way you changed the culture and expectations and possibilities of your profession. She had survived to teach, and teaching was its own form of service. She went inside and changed out of her dress uniform, hung it carefully in the closet next to her flight suits, next to the tangible evidence of a life spent in preparation for moments of crisis. She made dinner that she barely tasted, watched news programs that felt disconnected from her reality, went to bed early because she had a training flight scheduled for 600, and her body had learned long ago to sleep when it could. But before sleep came, she lay in darkness and thought about the A-10 that had carried her through fire, about whether aircraft had souls, about whether the partnership between pilot and machine was something mystical or just the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in mechanical systems. She didn't know. She would never know. But she believed, and belief was its own form of truth. The years passed in the way military years do, measured in deployments and training cycles, and the slow accumulation of rank and responsibility. Prophet moved from squadron command to wing operations, from tactical planning to strategic oversight, each promotion taking her further from the cockpit and deeper into the bureaucracy that made military aviation possible. She flew less and less, her hours logged in simulators and proficiency flights rather than combat missions, her skills staying current but no longer evolving. It was the natural progression of a military career, the price paid for influence and leadership, the trade-off between personal satisfaction and institutional impact. She accepted it because she had no choice, because refusing promotions meant stagnation, and stagnation meant irrelevance. But part of her mourned each step up the ladder, mourned the loss of the simple clarity that came from strapping into an aircraft and having a clear mission and the skills to accomplish it. Command was complicated. Strategy was ambiguous. Leadership required navigating human complexity that made tactical flying seem simple by comparison. She was good at it, good at the politics and planning and personnel management that defined senior leadership. But she missed the sky. She missed the feeling of an responding to her touch, missed the partnership with a machine that demanded everything and gave it back multiplied. The documentaries continued, each new war producing new stories of aviation heroism, new pilots pushing beyond limits, new missions that captured public imagination. Prophet's story became a touchstone, a reference point that journalists and historians used when discussing close air support, when analyzing the role of human decision-making in modern warfare, when exploring the tension between regulations and results. Film students made short films based on her mission. Military historians wrote journal articles analyzing her decisions. The story took on a life of its own, became something larger than the actual events, became mythologized in ways that both honored and distorted what had really happened. She watched it all with detached interest, recognizing elements of truth in the retellings while also seeing how narrative simplified complexity, how storytelling required clean arcs and clear heroes, how the messy reality of that morning had been polished into something more digestible for public consumption. The real story was more complicated, more ambiguous, more dependent on luck and circumstance than the documentaries acknowledged. But she understood the need for heroes, the way cultures required stories of individuals transcending limitations, the human hunger for narratives that proved the possible could be achieved through determination and skill. If her story served that purpose, if it inspired young pilots to push beyond what they thought possible, then the simplification was justified. 10 years after the mission, the Air Force invited her to speak at a leadership conference, wanted her to address senior officers about decision-making under pressure, about how to evaluate when to follow procedures, and when to trust experience. She stood before a room full of colonels and generals, people with more rank and less combat time, people who had risen through staff positions and political appointments rather than tactical excellence. She looked at them and wondered what she could possibly say that would resonate, what wisdom she possessed that they would value. She spoke about the illusion of control, about how command created distance from the immediate reality of combat, about how every decision made in an operations center cascaded down to someone in a cockpit or on the ground, someone whose life depended on the quality of that decision. She spoke about the danger of prioritizing process over outcome, about how regulations existed to prevent disasters but could also prevent necessary risks, about how leadership required the wisdom to know which was which. She spoke about trust, about building organizations where people felt empowered to make difficult calls, where experience was valued as much as rank, where the goal was mission success rather than procedural compliance. And she spoke about accountability, about how authority without responsibility created toxic cultures, about how leaders needed to own the consequences of their decisions rather than hiding behind regulations and hierarchies. The response was polite applause and thoughtful questions, senior officers engaging with her ideas while also subtly defending the systems they operated within. She didn't expect to change their minds. Institutional cultures changed slowly, if at all, and the Air Force had centuries of tradition wrapped around its operating procedures. But maybe some of them would remember her words the next time they faced a decision that pitted regulations against results, would remember that sometimes the right thing and the authorized thing diverged, and leadership meant having the courage to choose the former. She left the conference feeling both exhausted and energized, tired from the performance of public speaking, but lifted by the possibility that her words might matter, might influence decisions that would save lives in ways she would never see or know. This was what senior leadership offered, the chance to shape culture and policy rather than just executing missions, the opportunity to change systems rather than just working within them. It was its own form of service, its own kind of flying, even if it happened in conference rooms rather than cockpits. The promotion to colonel came with her 20th year of service, the rank achieved early enough that she could potentially make general before retirement, could reach the level where policy decisions were made and institutional direction was set. She accepted the promotion because refusing would have been insulting, would have signaled that she didn't value the trust the Air Force was placing in her. But the silver eagles on her uniform felt heavy, felt like responsibility and expectation, and the weight of decisions that would affect thousands of people she would never meet. She was given command of an entire wing, responsible for multiple squadrons and hundreds of personnel, overseeing operations that spanned continents and involved coordination with joint forces and international partners. It was the kind of position she had dreamed about as a young officer, the pinnacle of tactical leadership in military aviation, and she hated it. Not because she was bad at it. She was excellent, organized and decisive and capable of managing the overwhelming complexity that came with wing command. But because it meant flying a desk full-time, because it meant her connection to actual aircraft became nostalgic rather than current, because the thing she loved most about military aviation had been systematically removed from her daily life by the process of promotion and success. She could have declined the promotion, could have requested reassignment to a flying billet, could have chosen to remain in positions that kept her closer to the cockpit. But that would have meant accepting that her influence was limited, that her legacy would be defined by that one morning in Afghanistan rather than by systematic changes to how the Air Force thought about combat aviation. She chose the larger impact over personal satisfaction, chose responsibility over joy, chose to continue climbing the ladder even though each rung took her further from the thing she loved. It was what duty required. It was what service meant. It was also slowly killing something essential inside her, some spark that had defined who she was since she first learned to fly. The darkness came gradually, so slowly that she didn't recognize it at first. Started with difficulty sleeping, her mind refusing to shut down even when her body was exhausted, replaying decisions and scenarios and conversations in loops that prevented rest. Then came the moments of dissociation in meetings, her mind drifting away from budget discussions and personnel reviews to memories of flight, to the feeling of responding to her commands, to the visceral reality of combat flying that seemed more real than her current existence. She started skipping meals without noticing, her appetite gone, her body running on coffee and obligation rather than actual nutrition. She snapped at subordinates over minor issues, her patience eroded by the constant grind of administrative demands and political considerations. She knew what was happening. She had seen it in other senior officers, the way command could hollow you out if you weren't careful, the way responsibility without outlet could poison your relationship with service. She knew she should talk to someone, should seek help from mental health professionals who existed precisely for situations like this. But she was a colonel now, a senior leader, someone whose struggles could affect the careers of everyone in her command. Seeking help felt like admitting weakness, like proving she wasn't capable of handling the position she'd been given. So she pushed through, told herself it was temporary, convinced herself that she just needed to adapt to the new responsibilities, that the darkness would lift once she adjusted to wing command. It didn't. If anything, it deepened, became a constant companion that colored every interaction and decision, turned her life into a performance of competence that hid the growing emptiness inside. The breaking point came during a routine staff meeting, a discussion about flight training schedules and maintenance priorities and budget allocations. Someone was presenting a proposal to reduce flying hours for senior pilots, arguing that officers above the rank of major didn't need to maintain the same proficiency as younger aviators, that their time was better spent on leadership and planning rather than cockpit time. The logic was sound, the efficiency gains were real, the proposal made perfect sense from a resource management perspective. And Prophet realized that she was about to approve it, was about to implement a policy that would formalize the disconnection between senior leaders and the actual flying that made military aviation meaningful. She stood up in the middle of the presentation, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, every eye in the room suddenly focused on her. She could see confusion and concern on their faces, could see them trying to figure out what had triggered her reaction, could see the moment they started worrying about her stability. She looked at them, these competent officers who were just doing their jobs, just trying to make the organization run efficiently, just following the logical implications of bureaucratic thinking. She looked at them and saw herself, saw what she had become, saw the future she was helping to create where senior leaders had no direct connection to the mission they were supposed to understand. She spoke, her voice rough with emotion she had been suppressing for months. She told them that the proposal was insane, that leadership without connection to mission was just management, that the moment senior officers stopped flying was the moment they stopped understanding what they were asking of their pilots. She told them that every decision made in that room affected someone in a cockpit, someone whose life depended on the quality of leadership they received, someone who deserved commanders who remembered what it felt like to fly into danger. She told them that she had spent the past years becoming exactly the kind of leader she had resented as a junior officer, disconnected, theoretical, making decisions based on spreadsheets rather than understanding. She told them she was done, that she wouldn't approve the proposal, that she was going to go fly an A-10 right now, and anyone who wanted to stop her could come along and try. Then she walked out of the conference room, leaving behind shocked silence and probably ending her career, not caring about the consequences because staying in that room felt like dying slowly. She signed out an aircraft over the protests of the operations officer, who reminded her that she hadn't flown in 6 months, that she needed a proficiency check, that regulations required recent experience for solo flight. She filled out the paperwork anyway, completed a perfunctory pre-flight inspection, and climbed into the cockpit of an A-10 that felt both familiar and strange after so much time away. The engine start procedure came back to her through muscle memory, her hands finding switches and controls without conscious thought, her body remembering what her mind